Welcome to episode 13 of News Points on the Air, a production of the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventist. I'm your host, Milan Medley. The subject on the table for this episode is extremely delicate and complex, and some may even say controversial. We're here to talk about the Equality Act and the Fairness for All Act. The Equality Act, if passed, will expand protections found in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to include matters related to gender identity and sexual orientation. It would be a landmark piece of civil rights legislation. Here's the thing. Due to religious liberty concerns, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is in opposition of the act and has instead backed the Fairness for All, or FFA, Act. Supporters of FFA say it advocates the rights of the LGBTQAI plus community, citizens in secular places, while maintaining the ability to make decisions related to religious core beliefs. This is really tricky terrain, and to be honest, the church's stance doesn't quite sit well with me, and I'm nowhere close to being alone in this thinking. Many have been openly and vocally against it as well. That's why our guests were so eager to come on to this podcast to have this conversation with me. I'm so grateful to have Melissa Reid, who is the Associate Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the North American Division, and Todd McFarland, who is the Associate General Counsel of the North American Division Seventh-day Adventist and the Seventh-day Adventist Church's global headquarters, also known as the General Conference. So he works for the world headquarters and for the North American Division. And they're here to walk us through the church's position in the two acts. And I'm taking extra time with this introduction and with this to make it clear that the intention of this conversation is not to attack the church, but to have an honest conversation on precedent and perception. I'm so glad you've decided to join us for this episode. Let's get started. Melissa, Todd, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Good to be with you.
So, Melissa, can you first tell me when the Adventist Church decides to engage in legislation in the U.S. As it relates to religious liberty? You know, what are some things that you look for or kind of keep like an alert on? Tell me about that process.
Sure. Thanks for the question. And thanks again for the opportunity to chat today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So the Seventh-day Adventist Church really has been an advocate to our members of Congress and also, of course, on the state level as well, since really the inception of our denomination. I think we look back at the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and really saw our faith leaders standing up for the rights of our church members and of the institution itself, but also, I think very importantly, the rights of other people of faith and of no faith. So it's really been something that we have been involved in, since the late 1800s and continue to do so, both here at the North American Division and also at the General Conference. But as I said, we're really paying attention to legislation that affects both the individual's religious freedom, but also institutional religious freedom as well.
And Todd, can you list or describe some noteworthy laws or even cases the church has been involved in related to religious freedom?
Sure. The Adventist Church has had a long-standing role in religious freedom issues. One of the earliest cases that we were involved in is an important one called Sherbert versus Werner. That was a case that dealt with unemployment benefits, but it really set the sort of standard at the time for free exercise claims and how those interacted with state laws. On the legislative side, we've been involved in a number of bills. RLUPA, Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, we were a big part of. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a bipartisan bill passed in the early 90s we were a big part of. And so we have, and then another, other bills, related to everything, from pension benefits and how church plans interact with those. So there's a whole range of issues that we worked on. I also know that we'd worked on heavily the tobacco bill legislation that was passed a few years ago. That was the Adventist Church is one of the earliest denominations to support and participate in that effort.
And I'm glad you mentioned. Oh, go ahead, Melissa.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in and say, this last year when COVID relief appropriations were taking place, that was another conversation that we were involved in as far as trying to re-elevate charitable giving contribution levels as far as tax deduction.
Okay. And Todd, I'm glad you brought up the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, because that's something we'll come back to later in our conversation. So what's driving this conversation today, what brings you both here today, is we're talking about the Equality Act. So Todd, I would like to know if you can, facts on the ground, bare bones, well, not bare bones, what are the key elements of the Equality Act?
Sure. So what the Equality Act does in its simplest form, and the implications of this are a whole lot different, so don't be confused by its simplicity.
Yeah, and we can talk about implications later too.
Sure. It takes the entire breadth, really, of civil rights laws in the United States at the federal level, and it just wholesale adds in sexual orientation and gender identity as one of the protected categories. It makes no exceptions for religion, or it doesn't give any more exceptions there. It also says the Religious Freedom Restoration Act basically is repealed, but it says it can't be used for any of these kind of claims that are contained in the Equality Act. So that is in the 60-second version of what it does.
Right.
It adds those to the civil rights laws.
Yeah, and the civil rights laws you're referring to, that's the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yes, well, and it's more than just that. It's across the board. I should also say one of the other things it does, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has a lot of different components. One of those is what's known as public accommodation. And that is sort of what it sounds like. Most familiar with it back during the Civil Rights era, things like lunch counters and hotels and swimming pools and that kind of stuff. The way the Civil Rights Act is written right now, those areas of public accommodation are very narrow. And so the other thing that the Equality Act does is it vastly expands what is considered a public accommodation to really almost any space that a person off the street might be able to walk into. It also includes not just physical spaces, but virtual spaces as well. So online activities, really almost anything other than a private residence and private home, it would now be a place of public accommodation.
Okay, interesting. And Melissa, when did the Adventist Church decide, when did it first come on the church's radar? And then when was their mobilization to, get involved?
Right. Yeah. So, we've been paying attention to the growing tension between LGBT civil rights and religious freedom for quite some time. As we all know, public opinion in America around LGBT civil rights has undergone really something of a revolution over the past decade. And it's been a shift that has been driven really in large part by heightened awareness of the legal vulnerabilities faced by gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender Americans. Unfortunately, during that same time period, religious freedom, which really was once cherished as an American ideal, was inappropriately rebranded by opponents as the right to discriminate. And so we were approached by a couple of advocacy partners back in 2016 with the invitation to work together to craft a balanced, lasting legislative response to this ongoing conflict and bridge the gap between those two communities. And so what's come together is really an informal coalition of diverse faith traditions, LGBT rights groups, and religious freedom proponents developing around those shared beliefs.
And then that's the Fairness for All Act, but that's something we can we'll address fairness for all. I want to take people through, how we got there and how we got to where we are today. For someone who, is completely unfamiliar or may have seen a headline. And so we're here to kind of like walk us through and, just ask some questions. So Todd, you already hinted at this.
Yeah, Mom, but just before we get to that, I should say our involvement in getting exemptions on civil rights laws dealing with LGBT issues predates Fairness for All that Melissa was talking about. There was prior laws called the Employment Nondiscrimination Act, ENDA, which did pass the House and the Senate, but separately, and never became law. Those efforts, I think, started, if my memory is correct, in the 2008-10 time period, and we were involved in those events as well. So we've really, I think, been involved in this space really since its beginning. When there's been sort of proposals, I should say serious proposals, that got to committee and had a chance of and then got voted. The Adventist Church has been involved in that really since the beginning.
Okay, so I think that, kind of goes right into my next question. In a sense, since we've been, this conflict has, obviously been rising and it's been picking up more momentum. But for this act in particular, why does the Adventist Church see it and its implications as a threat?
So for a number of reasons, first of all, I think it would be not completely accurate to say that we view the Equality Act as a threat, because there's large parts of it that we support and have supported for a very long time. It is in many regards, I think, a lost opportunity because, and it's not an opportunity that's gone. I mean, we just had today, as we're recording this, the hearings on the Senate on the Equality Act. The head of HRC said that he was willing to talk to Republican senators and negotiate and make clarifications on the bill.
And HRC meaning the Human Rights Campaign?
Yes, Human Rights Campaign, which is, as they would describe themselves, the leading LGBT advocacy group in the country. Okay. Some of their other advocacy groups might not agree with them, but they are one of the biggest players.
And I guess, Todd, we could also say that they're probably the authors of the Equality Act. Would that be correct?
Yeah, them along with some others, they were a huge proponent of it. And the Equality Act was definitely a advocacy written bill that was then submitted. So we see it as a lost opportunity, but there are some challenges there. And some of those haven't gotten as much attention maybe in the public square as they should. There's been a lot of focus on women's sports and also women's colleges and so forth. That is a concern, and we don't want to diminish that concern, but that is far from the major concern. One of the major concerns for the Adventist Church is in the area of higher education. So Adventists in Adventist colleges and others who attend take advantage of what's known as Title IV funding. And this is things like Pell Grants and student loans. And, as much as I think 80% of our students at our colleges and universities are getting some type of aid there. Now, this is aid that's going to the student, not directly to the school, but, our schools and our students are really dependent upon that to go there. This bill threatens that support that our Adventist students get.
How is that threatened?
So what it does is it would mean that the schools would have to drop their conduct standards and also dissolve their sex segregated dorms. So the ability to have conduct standards for LGBT students would go away. You wouldn't be able to make a differentiation between marriage between one man and one woman and two men or two women. That distinction would be considered discrimination. I think sex stereotyping, in the words of the Equality Act. It would also mean that our single-sex dorms would most likely go away. We wouldn't be able to have those. In addition to that, it would also challenge us on transgender issues, as far as our ability to sort of deal with those issues. I want to be very clear: transgender students are welcome and, in fact, do attend our schools. But we need to integrate that into our understanding of how our faith relates to that issue. So yeah, the threat to our higher education is one of the major components. Other organizations such as ADRA, our Adventist Development Relief Agency, would also be threatened because of their hiring. ADRA supports and provides services to people of all faiths, no faiths across the board when it provides its international development work around the world. However, as part of its mission, it hires Seventh-day Adventists. This program would restrict that and would mean that they would no longer be able to hire solely Seventh-day Adventists, or even to take religion into account. And also, it would create a question as far as even in the local congregation and church about what spaces are sort of considered public accommodation and might have to be opened up to groups that local church may not be comfortable with, or to not just to groups, but also the groups that may have views they're not comfortable with. So, the main sanctuary itself is probably not under threat. Now, the Equality Act doesn't make an exemption for it, but we're fairly confident that the courts would, in fact, say that the main sanctuary can't be a place of a public accommodation. But things like the fellowship hall, ancillary buildings, a recreation center, these are all places that our churches want to open up and make available to the community as part of the outreach and community service. But the Equality Act would basically say if you do that and you make them available to the public, then you can no longer control what views are expressed there or what groups can come in and use it. And so we think for that, and there's a lot of other reasons, but just quickly, that's some of the main highlights.
So that's a lot, a lot of implications. And I just want to I have a quick follow-up, or maybe not quick, but follow-up. How often are those, those hypotheticals or, the implications of everything you just mentioned, and for the last one, for example, offering a church offering up its grounds or its fellowship halls and having some of the LGBTQ community wanting to use its grounds. Is that does that happen a lot? Is this something that's really to be kind of stressed over? Is it
well, it doesn't. First of all, the Equality Act is not the law yet. So under the Equality Act, it doesn't happen at all because that's not the law. But yes, you have seen the threats to religious. For instance, where it's happened mostly so far is in places that have been for profit, and so you saw the wedding venues and so forth that they could no longer restrict, even though the owners had religious views. But yes, there was a church in New Jersey that had a gazebo, and under New Jersey law, they said they had to open that up to same-sex couple. The state of Massachusetts put guidance out that said that, a sanctuary is protected from its public accommodation, but if you have something, quote, secular, like a spaghetti supper, then that would make it an area of public accommodation. And of course, those are the kind of events that churches open up all the time and want to have. So yes, I think it's a very real threat. It's not just a hypothetical. It has happened in limited circumstances where there's state and local laws. And once it becomes federal law, then the conflict is going to be pretty much more significant.
Yeah. And you mentioned go ahead, Melissa.
I was just going to point out that also I think it's important to note that it just takes one time to really sort of devastate whether it's a local house of worship or whatever. As far as, one of our concerns with the Equality Act is, as Todd said, how sort of vague it is in a lot of its, they'll say, this won't affect religious, but they won't, but it's not clarified. It's this very broad, sort of expansive and vague language. And so what that means is, and what opponents or proponents of the Equality Act have said is that the court system will then sort of decide, that definition. But we believe, and why we've been, for the past several years involved in trying to come up with a legislative response to these tensions, that, this is the responsibility of Congress, so that institutions do not have to go through legal battles that are expensive, that are time consuming, that, in all possibility could bankrupt their institution or seriously financially cripple it. And so I think, while it may not be a common occurrence, it certainly could be a very significant one. So one of the things that I wanted to add on, Todd mentioned some of the potential implications for our Seventh-day Adventist institutions of higher education. And he mentioned, federal funding, federal financial aid, and Pell Grants. And I think that it's important to note that this is especially concerning for the hundreds of thousands of religious college students who are people of color. And we know that from statistics within our own institutions, but especially when students of color are more likely to rely on these types of funding. And so, in essence, the Equality Act, as it's currently drafted, would make it harder for poor, minority, and immigrant students to achieve their college dreams. And I think that's important to note.
And so let's say Equality Act becomes law and we lose. So you're saying in an attempt to protect one class, it
yes.
may harm another class. But is that in a way saying that one class is higher or more important than the other?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it, because I think that's our whole premise as sponsors of a competing piece of legislation, the Fairness for All Act, in that we believe, no, what America has done so well, and you mentioned the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is really find that balance between competing interests, competing vulnerable populations. And so what we believe is that this is an unnecessary conflict between LGBT communities and their civil rights, which again, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is completely supportive of, publicly supportive, and proudly so, but also protecting, maintaining that the religious freedom, the religious identity of people of faith.
Yeah, so I want to stay in that arena for a little bit with my, next question. So, we say, we want to protect their rights and acknowledge their rights. As someone personally, and you both know, I'm very passionate about civil rights. And as we've already mentioned, this is a bit of an extension of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is pretty landmark, if it's passed, and even like where we are right now, is pretty historic. But for me, seeing that the church that I work for and grown up in is against it, to see, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is an opponent to this major civil rights movement, even like the term used, wrong side of history. Someone could say we're on the wrong side of history with this. Was there a discussion on the optics of the Adventist Church coming out against it? Both of you and Todd, you guys can answer.
Sure.
Well, sorry, Melissa.
Yeah, I was going to say, I really appreciate the optics, and I guess that's sort of how I would encourage you to maybe look at the issue, is that the optics of a Christian faith tradition taking a public stand for these rights of LGBT individuals in the workplace, in housing and public accommodation. We are one, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is one of very few denominations who have done so. And so, I think that's something to really be proud of. I think, again, like the optics of living out our faith by both honoring God and who he's called us to be, and honoring our neighbors at the same time. I think that's the optics that I'm appreciated and proud of.
Yeah, the other faith groups that I could find, the National Association of Evangelists, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Church of Latter-day Saints, Coalition of Jewish Values, Council of Christian Colleges and Universities were listed the Seventh-day Adventist Church was listed among that group.
Just to be clear, the USCCB, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, is adamantly opposed to this. They're not on that list. It's the
opposed.
They're opposed to both the Equality Act and Fairness for All.
Oh, okay. This is for the Equality Act. The list that I mentioned.
Well, they're opposed to the Equality Act. I mean, on this issue, us and USCCB are not on the same page at all.
Got it.
The other group, National Association of Evangelicals, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, CCCU, those groups, we are all part of our coalition.
Yeah, but there are also, and this is what you mentioned, Melissa, is what you hinted at, there are other faith groups on the other side who are proponents of this. So you have the Evangelical Lutheran Church and the U.S. Episcopal Church and other denominations and faith groups that would consider themselves more progressive. So there's this split, it seems, or you do see a clear division in terms of certain faith groups who are on one side or the other. But in terms of our community, what message do you think that's sending to those who are LGBTQAI+, who already struggle with belonging and feeling safe in our community because of how they identify and who they are? What message is this sending to them? What message do you think it is sending?
Well, I'll speak to that, because I think the message is what Melissa said before, is that we support a bill that provides rights. I mean, you can't look at the church's opposition of the Equality Act, or as drafted, and I think that's an important phrase, without looking at fairness for all in that context. The church did not come into this, as some of the others have done, some other Christian faiths have done, simply opposing it. The churches that you mentioned that are in favor of have different theological beliefs than us. So yes, we are different than the Episcopalians. We are different than, the Lutheran, the non-Lutheran Missouri Synod. They're very opposed to this, in that we have biblically based and grounded theological beliefs when it comes to same-sex marriage, same-sex behavior, and conduct standards. So I think the optics for, those LGBT individuals in the church should be that the church is supporting their rights in the public sphere, but the church also has the right to operate in the public sphere and not have, quite frankly, a religious view of others forced upon it.
And were you about to say something, Melissa? Okay. Okay. So Todd and Melissa, you can join this, answer this too. But Todd, as we had mentioned, and we could say, I can say I probably know the answer, but just so that it's said, with this being an extension of the Civil Rights Act 1964, what was the church's stance with that act? Did we say anything? Did we oppose? Did we say anything in support or opposition? Where was the church then? And the Adventist Church wasn't in great, they weren't leading champions of what equality would look like, in terms of like the Adventist Church in the US at the time, but where did they stand when it came to this act?
So, well, first of all, I don't agree that the Adventist Church has not been on the right side on equality issues. The Adventist Church from its founding was founded by a bunch of abolitionists. We had a radically opposed to slavery. And the Adventist Church, again, throughout its history, has been one of the most diverse churches. We didn't split off like the Southern Baptists and others. We're running HBCU and otherwise reaching out to, people of color, what was known as, Black people back then. As far as the Civil Rights Act is 1964, I'm not the historian on that. To the best of my knowledge, the church never opposed that, and there's no reason for us to oppose it because it had the appropriate balance there. You referred to it, this bill is just an extension of it. It's more than an extension of it. It is an expansion of it too. It expands the definition of the area of public accommodation considerably, which is a huge threat. It also expands the area of what federal funds can be denied for. And it also puts SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity, in the class of race, as opposed to probably a better analogy, which is the class of gender. Because while there are very few, if any, there are a handful of exemptions for race, there are more areas in which gender and sex is considered exceptions to that for religious reasons and so forth. Things like a BFOQ, more limited protections as far as it's not mentioned as a public accommodation, because we have generally understood in society that while racial distinctions and so forth don't have their place, we got rid of the Negro Leagues a long time ago when it came to baseball. In areas like sports and so forth, we do recognize gender differences, and that's one issue. But more importantly, even getting away from the sports issue, there's been other areas in which we understand that organizations and churches constitutionally, whether we agree with it or not, have the right to make those distinctions that they don't in the area of race. So it's not just an extension of it, it's also an expansion of it.
So, and I know we are a diverse denomination and ethnically, and we do, like you mentioned, we have an HBCU, we do have Oakland University, but there are plenty of, Black Adventist leaders who would push back and say, especially during the time when that act was passed in the 60s, that, there was not examples of racism. So that's kind of where the question
I just want to be
from.
I just want to be very clear. That was not meant to defend everything the Adventist Church has done, or there hasn't been individual instances of racism. But again, I think the fundamental problem with the question is the analogizing and saying that sexual orientation is just like race. It's not, and even the churches in its own statements, as far as dealing internally, both for its standards for membership, its standards for church employment and so forth, make a very strong distinction, an important distinction between the status of same-sex attraction and the conduct. So unlike race, which is a status-based distinction, the church's view on sexual orientation is status-based, in fact, conduct-based. And as our statement said, individuals, regardless of sexual orientation, who conform themselves to the church's teaching on marriage, human sexuality, etc., are free and do participate in the life of the church. So I think that's another distinction that the church makes, that makes it really in a different category than race.
Yeah, I hear you. And not to belabor this point, because this even comes to the larger point of like different groups, different protected classes, when there's a conflict between different classes. So, you stated, Todd, how, and even the church, race and orientation and identity aren't on the same level, but advocates would say, yes, it's the same, with sexual identity, gender, and race, both deserve equal and equal protected status. And at least from my understanding with the research, that's part of the language that's in the Equality Act as well. But Melissa, I wanted to get into fairness for all, which is kind of like a response to, the momentum behind the Equality Act, and kind of like the churches are, well, we didn't write it, we're supporting this, kind of like the response to the Equality Act. So can you walk me through the timeline for that?
Sure. I touched on it just a little bit. And just to say, we actually were involved in the drafting of the legislation. Okay. The esteemed Todd McFarland that's joining me on the podcast today is one of those legal experts who was.
Many hours stuck in a conference room helping draft that.
Yeah. But also, our involvement, and I think I could speak with our coalition members, for our coalition members as well, was not in a response to the Equality Act, but rather in a response to sort of the social dynamics that I was describing earlier, and seeing how those dynamics between the tensions between those, LGBT civil rights and religious freedom could be resolved effectively without, as we talked about, elevating one area over the other. And so we certainly saw that, we've seen that happen on the state level with LGBT anti-discrimination legislation that wraps in or includes those religious protections. We saw that happen in Utah. We've seen it happen in New York State, in California. All of those, when we talk about the Equality Act and the conversation about the Equality Act, we often mention that there are several states that do not, one of the needs for comprehensive federal not LGBT non-discrimination legislation is because some states do not have that. But the majority of those who do already have those anti-discrimination protections for LGBT individuals, the majority by and far also include those religious exemptions. And that is what our challenge is. That is where our concern is as far as the Equality Act. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is, again, we are proponents of standing up for the rights and the dignity of LGBT individuals in their housing, in their workplace, in their public accommodation. And that's not the issue. And so I think, unfortunately, people of faith who hold that traditional view of marriage and sexuality have really been sort of misrepresented as far as the fact that we are trying to find that balance between the two. But jumping back to the fairness for all. So I said, in 2016 is really when we began the conversation about actually working with some other advocacy partners to come up with a legislative response to this conflict. And so that coalition came together really around a couple of different shared beliefs. One is which no American should lose their home or their livelihood simply for being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Again, this is very, again, I would say, I'm so proud of the Seventh-day Adventist Church for being a part of a group that is saying that about their lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender members and brothers and sisters. And so the second belief is that religious persons should not be forced to live, work, or serve their community in ways that violate their sincerely held beliefs. And again, we sort of, when I talked earlier, I talked about sort of religious freedom really being unfairly rebranded as the right to discriminate. And I mean, for the vast majority of our history, instead of being referred to as the right to discriminate, it was the right to live out your faith. And it's just been as society has recently changed as far as sort of its morals and standards and conducts, that has been rebranded. And so what we believe is that it's possible to find a practical and durable solution to this ongoing challenge of rights by working together and by rejecting this polarizing rhetoric, this all or nothing sort of approach. And so the result of that several years of partnership is the Fairness for All Act that we've referenced a couple of times. It was introduced in the House in 2019, was reintroduced this session just a few months ago, or just maybe even a month ago. This time with, I think, more than double the number of co-sponsors. And this year we are anticipating that it will be introduced in the Senate as well.
Are you, can you see why with that explanation, and even just someone who would research fairness for all, why they would still see that that act as providing religious groups with the quote license to discriminate, meaning we're okay with yes, you deserve housing, employment shouldn't be compromised in a secular setting, but are we then saying it's okay for us to still be able to discriminate when it comes to employment, for example? So can you see why some, and especially opponents of fairness for all, would say, yeah, you say, you want equal rights for those in the LGBT community, but you're still giving allowances or leaving space for discrimination to occur. Yeah, in your setting, but discrimination is still happening.
Well, but I think the answer is that a church has the right to have the people that represent it uphold its standards. And so, and again, this is only dealing with conduct. This is not dealing with status. It's only in fact, there's a provision in the employment section that says that churches have to, with reasonable consistency, I believe is the phrase, don't quote me on that, but something along that lines, have to apply its conduct standards. So a church that simply only and I got to be careful here because there's certain category of workers that the churches have absolute protection for. But, a religious organization that fired, say, a secretary and so forth, and only fired the gay and lesbians, but not uphold any standards for its straight employees, could still be held liable under this. But yes, I mean,
and should.
Yeah, it is the question,
and that's under fairness for all, Todd, what you just said.
That's under fairness for all. And so labeling something discrimination, is a very pejorative term because, I mean, on one hand, you're right. We are discriminating between those who uphold the church's standards and conduct and those who reject it. And, for gay and lesbians who don't want to uphold the church's standards, why would you think that you should be able to work for an organization that you don't believe and support? That is not a reasonable expectation for LGBT individuals to say, well, I want to work, I want to take your tithe dollars, I want you to pay me a salary, but I'm going to live a life that is inconsistent with your standards and what you teach. And I don't think it's unfair for religious.
Could that be an interpretation though, maybe?
Huh?
Could that perhaps come down to interpretation?
Well, no, I mean, if a person is, I mean, yes, an interpretation of the Bible and our biblical beliefs, but I think everyone agrees the church should be able to have that. But a person who, and again, be very clear, the Adventist Church has applied its sexual conduct standards employment against straight individuals multiple times more than it ever has gays and lesbians. So the idea that we have these conduct standards around human behavior, and it's not just sex, by the way, the church has other standards when it comes to alcohol use, tobacco use, et cetera, Sabbath observance, that this is just simply a pretext to get rid of gay people, and we don't care about the sexual misconduct of straight employees. It's not upheld by the facts. So yeah, a church needs to be able to, if you want to use the word discriminate between people who support and uphold its standards and those who don't.
All right, Melissa, were you about to?
I guess I was just going to say, taking it sort of out of the religious, people of faith and LGBT civil rights, sort of out of that context, but still talking about those balancing of protected classes. We talked a little bit before about gender and all male or all female colleges or universities. So we look at like Spelman, for example, or Morehouse. So those practices of only admitting a particular gender of student, you could refer to that as discriminatory, right? But when, again, we are looking at those balance of protected classes and the overall mission of those educational institutions, again, I think we can recognize it makes sense for this to be appropriate, for this to take place, for this to occur. So I was trying to take it out of sort of the context of LGBT civil rights and religious freedom.
And that prompted a thought, Melissa. Todd, has there ever been, and Melissa too, has there ever been such a conflict between different protected classes? We're having religious freedom and, when it comes to LGBT community, it seems, maybe it's because I'm living through it now that it seems so grand. And I wonder, were there other protective classes that were in conflict like this in recent history?
Not really. I mean, first of all, the whole idea that government is going to protect certain groups and protect classifications is a relatively new one. I mean, it's certainly post-Civil War, and there were some post-Civil War laws, 1981 and so forth, that protected contract and so forth, and then you get to the Civil Rights era. But one of the reasons we haven't seen conflicts like this before is there's always been an understanding that you're going to balance and give exemptions for religion. Even the Civil Rights Act of 1964 contains a number of exemptions for religious organizations. In those protected, those groups, it is really the Equality Act that stands out as I can't think of another situation where we've passed a civil rights law and have not had any protection for religion within it. Just real quick. So what's changed really isn't the looking for an exemption for religious or accommodation for religions, is the fact that those, are not available.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to what Todd was saying as far as an illustration from the hearings that we referenced today that are happening in the Senate Judiciary Committee for the Equality Act. One of the bill proponents actually referenced the Americans with Disabilities Act. Again, people with disabilities are another protected class under the Civil Rights Act. But the Americans with Disability Act, again, has those carve-outs, those religious protections that Todd is talking about. And this is the first time that we are seeing civil rights legislation that does not respect or does not mirror those carve-outs that we've seen previously.
And that also includes overriding, I think, Todd, is the word you use, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And do you think, I guess, the HRC, who you said, basically they wrote it or, fueled this bill. Do you think they believed that the FRRA, or sorry, had a little dyslexic moment. The RFRA, RIFRA. That's kind of hard. That's kind of hard for me to say. I'm going to do that. Do you think there was a perception of abuse of that to, further discrimination?
Well, I'll let HR speak for themselves. The fact that they are not happy with RIFRA, even though it was passed overwhelmingly in the House and the Senate and signed by a Democratic president, and was only really restoring what the Supreme Court had illegitimately, in my view, taken away in Smith. Yes, they have not liked
in
RIFRA.
Smith?
Employment Division versus Smith was a case that RFRA was attempting to respond to.
Okay.
And so, yes, RFRA has been on their hit list for a very long time. And I think it just goes to the fact that they just feel that, religious organizations and religious liberty just needs to cede to, to LGBT rights. And, what we've suggested and what we think moving forward is a way that can accommodate both interests. It does not give, people of faith and religious organizations just the right to sort of run untrammeled through the country, but it says that they can still participate, they can still, have their beliefs and practice those and carry out in the public square and not be discriminated against. And LGBT individuals, also receive the protections that that they're entitled to.
I think another important point, and I'm going back to the committee that took place this morning, just because that's what's fresh in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But I think an important point that was made was that the majority of claimants under RFRA, under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, it's hard for me to say too, are actually not Christians, which of course is Christianity is the majority faith tradition here in the United States, but it's actually Muslims and Jews who most often have made those claims under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And so I thought that was an interesting point, because again, if we look at minority faith traditions who are targets of hate crimes and such, who are applying for security grants, all of those sorts of things, we sort of talked about the unintended consequences of other vulnerable populations earlier when we talked about higher education and receiving federal fund. And I think that's another illustration of then those unintended consequences.
So as of today, so March 17, the Senate is hearing, or are they taking a vote today on the Equality Act, or is just going through discussion right now? So as of time of this recording, the Senate is, reviewing the Equality Act. The Senate, or the act needs 10 Republicans to vote for it to push it through. And it seems unlikely that will happen. Maybe that may change. So it passed the House, but it's in the hands of the Senate now. What are your predictions for the Equality Act? And then we can, or maybe it will be one and the same. How do you think Fairness for All will fare? Because it doesn't seem to have support on the Democratic side. So what's the future for this legislation?
Well, I mean, I think that this is the congressional season, this congressional season that's happening right now, our session, is really a prime opportunity to pass some sort of comprehensive LGBT non-discrimination. If we as a body could come together to protect one another, both LGBT individuals and people of faith. And I think too often when we sort of come to this moment during, sort of a tough policy dilemma, and one that I think concerns really the core of American social values, we unfortunately take the easy way out by having these zero-sum narratives that we've discussed, and so really only put forth one-sided policy prescriptions. And so I think unfortunately that's what we're seeing occur in with the Equality Act, as you mentioned. Unless those 10 Republicans they get those 10 Republican votes, it's going to die. It will not pass. And so again, I just think this is unnecessary. These zero-sum narratives, these one-sided policy prescriptions. I think they're unnecessary, and I think that there is enough agreement here to be able to advance civil rights for everyone, gay people, trans people, people of faith. And I think it's really up to lawmakers to take advantage of the opportunity.
Yeah, because right now, as it stands, like you were saying, it's a bit of a standoff, just numbers wise. So it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds.
It's also, I think, important to understand, even though this hasn't necessarily come out publicly, I think it's understood that there aren't 50 votes amongst the Democrats to pass the Equality Act as it stands right now in the Senate. So if it were to go to a vote right now, there aren't even 50 votes as written. So it's not just a Republican versus Democrat. Now, the Democrats that, you know, are opposed to it have not come out as publicly and so on. But there are several Democrats who've, you know, we have reason to believe expressed significant concerns about it as drafted. And again, it's not that the Equality Act and this idea can't pass or, you know, is something that can happen. It's just there needs to be a bilateral discussion and sort of the HRC, our way or the highway approach, which really has been the approach. There's been zero willingness to negotiate on this. It just hasn't, just isn't going to get this bill passed.
This is all so interesting. And obviously with something so complex and delicate in terms of two protected classes, I keep saying that, but that's really what it comes down to. And that's why, it's come down to, us versus them in terms of, the numbers and like legislation and even drafting it and everything. It's just so fascinating, especially since it's a recent phenomena for this type of conflict to get to this point. Yeah, so I guess, we'll just see at this point. Is there a specific timeline? Because I know President Biden says he would want to see something, advancing LGBT rights by April, which is, in a couple of weeks technically. So, I
have some bad news.
You might get your vaccine. You might get your vaccine shot before you get the Equality Act passed.
Yeah, but perhaps, just more conversations are needed. Like you were saying, Melissa, both with lawmakers, but even within, the Adventist Church, because there's also the fear that people won't take the time to understand the nuances of what we're saying and just see, oh, the Adventist Church is opposed it. Therefore, I, as an individual member or pastor or elder would, enact some form of discrimination. And that's certainly not what is happening here. But then, we don't want to see adverse effects of what's happening here take place based on misunderstanding. But then, have to be multiple conversations. It's an ongoing thing. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, and I was going to say, absolutely, I completely agree with you. And that's why I'm so appreciative of the opportunity today to have this conversation with you. And I wanted to share with you a quote from one of our advocacy partners, Tyler Deaton, he's the policy head for the American Unity Fund, which is the Republican LGBT rights group. And as I said, part of our coalition. But one of the things that he pointed out—
Republican LGBT rights coalition group?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, wow.
Don't have your stereotypes now about who supports what.
I was just unaware, Todd. I was just purely unaware.
You can't be
we're all learning here today.
Yeah.
But one of the things that he said, as a gay man, who both respects, I think, advocates for LGBT civil rights, but also respects that sort of historic place that religion has held in society. So what he said, and I was just going to quote that to you guys, he says, Americans' founders anticipated today's civic and religious debates and disagreements because they are not so different from the debates of the 18th century. Our nation is big enough and strong enough to accommodate a wide range of beliefs and practices. Our diversity is part of America's strength. And again, as a Christian, those words resonate with me because we serve a God who is big enough and strong enough and allows us as our creator to have those differences. And he certainly points us in a direction that he believes is most reflective of his love for us. But that ultimately those decisions are ours. And I am humbled by that.
Yeah, they're ours. And, at the end of the day, we still want to see, people treated fairly, at the end of the day, in our different spheres. Todd, any final thoughts?
No, I think Melissa said it well there. I just think we need to, come to a resolution on this that accommodates all the interests and sort of drop this winner take all approach that, quite frankly, we've talked about this mostly from a left perspective today, but the conservative Republicans and others have been equally sort of unwilling to move, and we just need to move past all that.
Yeah, and you said resolution, but with this complexity, it certainly won't happen overnight. We just have to remain engaged and and listen with open minds, and have wonderful conversations like we did today. So thank you again, Melissa and Todd, for your time and your expertise. When do you have any timeline that we can grant our audience in terms of when we think we may see something? I'm just going to tell people to subscribe to News Points, and just that's how you're going to find out. But any even though it's on the Senate floor, or Senate's talking about today, any inside scoop?
Yeah, I don't think we know that, because I don't think that it will be brought to a vote on the floor. When we expect it to pass through committee today, right? And so I don't imagine that the majority part will bring the bill to a vote until they're sure they have the votes for it, right? And so I think we really don't know when that will take place, or if it will take place. It may just end up this congressional term. As we all know, congressional terms or sessions are 2 years, and we've just begun this new one in January. So just a very long way of saying we don't know. And definitely stay tuned to News Points and this podcast.
Yes, NADAdventist.org, click on news. All right. Thank you again, Todd and Melissa. So I just said it, but it bears repeating. If you want to keep up with this news, with the Equality Act and fairness for all, you have to subscribe to News Points. As you hear me say every episode, it's our weekly digital newsletter that has news stories, special announcements, and media resources. It is the one-stop shop to get news relating to the Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America. There's no beating around the bush with this one. So you have to go to NADAdventist.org, then click on news to subscribe. That's NADAdventist.org, then hit news in order to subscribe. All right, this episode was edited, produced, and hosted by me, Milan Medley. Its executive producers are Dan Weber, Julio Munoz, and Kimberly Moran. Graphics were by Jonathan LaPointe. Listen and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. We only want 5-star ratings, so nothing less. And make sure you write a glowing review. If you have any questions that you want to ask me or have me pass along to Todd or Melissa, send them to ontheair@nadadventist.org. That's ontheair@nadadventist.org. That's all for now. We'll see you in April.